Pattern markings are there for a reason and they're really important, so you need to pay attention to what pattern markings you have. These 5 pattern markings we'll go through today, they are really, really important, because if you don't get them right, then the way that your garment hangs, the way that your garment will sew will be a lot different and a lot more difficult. So yeah, pay attention to these 5 pattern markings. Grain line. So you need to make sure that the grain line of your pattern piece is following the grain line of your fabric. Grain line goes up the fabric, so we have the selvage edge there, then we have the grain line, and then we have the cross grain which goes across. So the pattern piece that you have, you'll notice that you'll have a line and it'll have 2 arrows on the top, 1 arrow on the top and 1 arrow on the bottom. That's how you place your pattern piece onto your fabric. So you need to make sure that those lines follow the grain line or the cross grain or the bias of your material. If you put your pattern piece on in any weird direction, then it's not going to hang correctly and you'll find that pieces will stretch unevenly. So it does need to follow the grain line of the fabric. Next up is fold line. So the fold line is where you place the pattern piece on the fold edge of the material. So if it's folded over. I haven't yet seen any pattern, I don't think, that's folded on the bias. So everything is folded either on the grain line or the cross grain, depending on how your pattern says to place your pattern pieces onto your fabric. Fold line doesn't include seam allowance, so you don't put the pattern piece with a 1.5 or whatever your seam allowance is onto that fabric. That fold line of that pattern goes right on the fold line of the fabric. Darts, so the placement of darts on your pattern piece. So these are pretty important because they are going to determine the shape of your garments. You can get bust darts, waist darts, back darts, shoulder darts. If you're adapting a pattern, then you can put darts wherever you like, really. But that's how the garment will make like a 3D shape, go from a flat piece to a 3D shape. So the placement of them is pretty important, and if your pattern says to put this dart here, you need to make sure that it's correct onto that fabric. I mark mine in with tailor's chalk, so I just mark on the tops and then the point of the dart, and I join it up with like a straight line. You can also do this with like tailor's tacks, so just sort of big stitches, and then just cut through them between the layers of fabric. Then that will give you the placement of the darts. Darts really should be slightly curved. So if you think of the way that like a body is, there's no corners really. There's no sort of sharp points. So darts really should be slightly curved, and that's just ever so sort of slightly bent. I mean, when I sew darts, I try to make sure that the stitches at the point of the dart almost run parallel to that fabric, so that it just curves it off. It's not like a sharp angle or anything. Maybe I'll make another video of this later on. Cutting, stitching and seam allowance. So most patterns now have the seam allowance included, but you might find with some more vintage patterns that they don't have the seam allowance included, so you need to put that onto the pattern. Some patterns also have the stitching line, and this is really handy if, say, in certain places the seam allowance is different. So I had a pattern that the lapel of the collar, it was much thinner, so I needed to use that stitching line that was put on the pattern instead of just using the standard seam allowance. And of course the cutting line is really important as well, because you need to know where you're going to be actually cutting out your fabric. Sometimes overlooked, sometimes just ignored, but notches are kind of important if you need to line up, when you need to line up the seams of your garment. So notches mark which seams go against which, so you can have notches in many different ways. Some of the patterns just have little lines, others have the triangles, and yeah, they help to line up parts of garments, parts of the pattern pieces. If you've got like a sleeve that needs to have ears put in at the top, or if it's gathered, then the notches around the arm side and the sleeve piece do come in handy, because that will show you, that if you gather it too far down, then it's not going to fit right. So then you need to make sure that the notches are lined up. They are handy parts of a pattern piece, of a pattern. The way I was taught with my first textiles teacher was to cut into the fabric where the notches are. So the pattern has, it's got triangles, so it's got a triangle where the notch needs to be. So I was taught to cut into that fabric piece. However, I've changed that now, because you shouldn't really do it. If you've got a fabric that's going to fray really easy and you put an intentional notch into that, it's just going to weaken that area, you know. And it depends on how often you're handling that material when you are sewing. You might find that will fray, and that will fray quite a lot, so you might go into your seam allowance and you don't want to, or past your seam allowance, and you really don't want to be doing that. So don't cut into the fabric is basically what I'm saying. Is instead either cut the triangles on the outside of the fabric or mark those notches in with tailor's chalk. And generally that's what I do, is I just mark the notches on the fabric with tailor's chalk. There we have 5 pretty important pattern markings that you need to pay attention to when you're sewing your patterns. And if you have any questions or any comments, or if you have a marking on your pattern that you're not too sure of, then do put a comment in the comment section and I will do my best to help you. So thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video, and I'll see you next time.